Good evening, everybody. Welcome, and thank you so much for being here for this Mondays at the Mess. Bloody Sunday, 21st of November, 1920, Assassination, Massacre and Reprisal. Mondays at the Mess is a talk series run by Dublin City Council Culture Company for Richmond Barracks. Usually takes place in person in Richmond Barracks in Inchicore, but we've had to adapt to the times like so many have. So thank you for joining us for this virtual talk. In a few minutes, I'm going to hand over to our speaker for this evening, but before I do, I just wanted to let you know that there will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the talk. And if you do have a question, you can type it into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can at the end. So our speaker today is John Dorney, who is an independent historian, editor of the website The Irish Story, and the author of Peace After the Final Battle, the story of the Irish Revolution 1912 and 1924, of which there's a new edition this year, and the Civil War in Dublin, the fight for the Irish capital 1922-1924. And we're delighted to have John with us here today to talk about this very important subject. So without further ado, I will hand over to John.
Okay, thanks very much, Kate, and thank you everyone for joining, although I can't see you. First thing I'm going to do is just put up my slideshow, so bear with me for 1 second. Okay, so that should be clear to everybody, I hope. I'm going to be talking about Bloody Sunday 1920 today. Now, it's one of a number of days in the 20th century in Ireland which has this title, Bloody Sunday. It's the bloodiest of those days. So there's at least 34 people killed in Dublin that day, as we'll talk about. It's a brutal day on all sides. It's a day where innocent people suffer. It's a day also where the perpetrators of violence eventually suffer for what they had done on all sides. What I'm going to be doing is really going through the events and trying to put them into context. So I'm trying to explain what happened essentially and why it happened. So, and apologies for all the text, but I thought it might be more beneficial than pictures with the format that we have in these days. Excuse me. So, Bloody Sunday is an act of political violence. It's an act of force, but it occurs in a political context. And the context is, first of all, we can go as far back as the Home Rule crisis of 1912 to 14 and Easter Rising, but the immediate context is the 1918 election, where the Sinn Féin party wins the majority of seats in Ireland in the British general election and declares the first Dáil, declares the Irish Republic to be in existence. So this is very important to remember from the point of view of Bloody Sunday, the political context. Home Rule, which is limited self-government, had been offered, it had been blocked, it never was enacted. Sinn Féin, if you like, raised the stakes in the election of 1918 by declaring full independence. Now, obviously, the British administration in Ireland didn't recognize this, but the independence movement, the Sinn Féin movement and the volunteers or the IRA are acting as if they're an independent state. They have ministries, they have courts, they're acting as if they are an independent government. Second piece of context here is the Restoration of Order in Ireland Act in the summer of 1920. Now, the British government initially reacted to Sinn Féin's declaration of independence in early 1919 by basically kind of ignoring it. So they started to draft a new Home Rule Bill, which would be a partitioned Home Rule Bill. There would be Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland, both with, again, limited self-government. And they began arresting suspects, Sinn Féin and IRA volunteer suspects, as 1919 went on. But the IRA, as they began to call themselves, the Irish Republican Army, fought back. They basically started guerrilla warfare from late 1919. We'll talk about that, assassinations in Dublin, around the country really from early 1920. And the government's response, the British government's response in the summer of 1920 was the Restoration of Order in Ireland Act. And it's been described as a halfway house to martial law. So among other things, this gave the military priority over the police in some ways, in the sense that, for example, a inquest jury into murders were run by the military now, run by military court martials. Suspects arrested for political crimes were tried by the military, by court martial. And for example, we're going to talk about the raid on Croke Park, which ended in a mass shooting, was ordered by the military, even though it was carried out by the police. The other aspect of the British government response was the deployment of more police, or what we might call paramilitary police, to Ireland in the form of the Black and Tans and Auxiliaries. Now, the Black and Tans, contrary to much of what's said in kind of popular discourse, were not a separate corps at all. They were part of the RIC. They were recruits into the RIC, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, the Royal Irish Constabulary, the police. Usually they were war veterans from Britain. The Auxiliaries were a different thing. The Auxiliaries were an adjunct to the RIC from ex-officers from the Great War. But both of these groups, as well as the old RIC and the military, embarked on a series of reprisals from September to October 1920. And the British perspective is, and they say these things like this: the IRA have had all the fun up to now. The gunmen have had all the fun. Now we're kind of going to get our own back. So they start collective reprisals on towns like famously Balbriggan in September 1920. But you can list off the towns: Tuam, Trim, and so on. Galway City, a host of towns like Mallow across the south of Ireland. And by September, October 1920, Lloyd George is saying, we have murder by the throat. In other words, these collective reprisals for IRA actions, Lloyd George thinks will force the population to give up the IRA. Then the militant Republicans, the ones who have declared independence, will be forced to go back and talk about home rule, which is the British government's preferred solution. Now, this is a complicated political context, right? Because the British government is essentially, by this point, fighting a war, a guerrilla war in Ireland. They don't want to call it a war. They want to put down the gunmen, as they call them, the murder gang. That's what they call the IRA. But they also want a negotiated solution, which involves self-government, home rule. They just don't want to give as much home rule as the separatists wanted, as you could argue the people voted for in 1918. So it's kind of a complicated political context, and this informs some of what's going on. The other thing is, because British government aims are quite confused, and because they respond to this in this kind of convoluted way, there's a very divided command among their forces in Ireland. So you have the Royal Irish Constabulary, which are commanded now by a military man, Colonel Tudor, who styled himself as Chief of Police. You have the Auxiliaries, who are led by another military man, Crozier. You have the military, which is led by Neville Macready. And even though all of these are supposed to be combined, they're actually all acting on their own. And this, again, feeds into what happens on Bloody Sunday. The other thing to remember, and this is important, an important context that's also overlooked, is that already by this point, and we're going to start the story in like early November 1920, back channel talks have already been opened between David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister in Britain, and Arthur Griffith. Arthur Griffith was the founder of the Sinn Féin party, but he was also the acting head of the Irish Republic declared in 1919. And the talks basically are about how are we going to end the violence and what might we offer to bridge the gap between these two possible solutions: an independent Irish Republic on the one hand, home rule within the United Kingdom on the other hand. Now, against this background, this political background, in Dublin City, we have what's commonly called the intelligence war. Now, before we get into the details, in the broad strokes, what does this mean? This means it's, as far as the British government is concerned, it's a police action. It's to do with putting down terrorism, if you like, reprisal. The reprisals are to do with putting down terrorism and gunmen and murder gang. And so these are all the terms they use about the IRA. But it also means arresting civilian activists. There's a mass arrest really of civilian activists around the end of 1919 when IRA assassination started, and also in early 1920. The people who are responsible for targeting arrests are the Dublin Metropolitan Police. So I have here in my third point here, the G Division, which is the detective division of the Dublin Metropolitan Police. And Michael Collins, who grows ever more prominent in kind of public consciousness through the 1996 movie, but also through, I think, internet and so on, set up the squad to counter this. Now, the squad, again, is often viewed as this kind of autonomous thing, but the squad, and we see some of them here, including some of the men who were out on Bloody Sunday, is the hit squad of IRA intelligence. Their job is to carry out the operations ordered by Michael Collins' Department of IRA Intelligence. And if you like, the squad are the foot soldiers for the intelligence department. So it's not like the squad are going around picking targets themselves. I think some people think that. They are the hit squad. In IRA military pensions, they're termed the active service unit of IRA GHQ. So Michael Collins is one of the heads of the IRA. So Richard Mulcahy is the chief of staff, and in theory, both of them report to Colin Brewer, the Minister for Defence. But the squad are Collins' personal active service unit, if you like. Now, over the winter of 1919 and early 1920, the squad basically destroyed the Dublin Metropolitan Police G Division. There's 12, I think, assassinations of detectives and also one or two civilians in late 1919, early 1920. And this goes a long way to destroying the existing Crown Forces intelligence on the IRA in Dublin. I think some of this may be a bit exaggerated, or it may be a more complicated story than we think. For example, it's often stated that Michael Collins was this elusive figure. The British had no picture of him, had no idea who he was. And I'm afraid that's not credible, because Collins was imprisoned twice already by the British. He was imprisoned for his role in the 1916 Rising and interned in Frangach. He was also imprisoned in April 1918 as part of the campaign against conscription. He was imprisoned briefly for a seditious speech that he gave in County Longford. It may be that the files in Collins were removed from the DMP files by sympathetic detectives who Collins had recruited, like David Nelligan in Dublin Castle or Ned Broy in what's today Pearse Street, in those days New Brunswick Street police station. Whatever the reason was, though, the killings as well as the turning of certain detectives, the DMP intelligence operation was basically destroyed by the summer of 1920. And as part of this British fight back, which I talked about, which also involved the Restoration of Order in Ireland Act and the deployment of Black and Tans and Auxiliaries, British military intelligence arrives in Dublin in big numbers. Now, these were military intelligence officers who were trained at a school at Hounslow near London, and about 100 of them are imported into Dublin. And their job is to basically decapitate the top of the IRA, to find Collins, yes, to find also Richard Mulcahy, and to locate also the ministries of the Dáil, the self-declared Irish Republic, and to shut it down. The man at the head of them was this man, Ormonde de Winter, Ormonde Épée de Winter, to give him his full title. Now, like many of the men drafted into supposedly the police in Ireland, he's a former military man. He had fought in the First World War. He was an artillery man, a personal friend of Tudor, who was the chief of police. Mark Sturgis, who was one of the civil servants in Dublin Castle, described him as a snake, had the morality of a snake. And from that, perhaps we can divine his ruthlessness. But one of the contradictions here, or one of the interesting things, is that Winter was a military man given control of military officers who were responsible for amassing intelligence. But Winter didn't report to the military. He didn't report to General Macready or General Boyd, who was the head in Dublin. He reported to the police, to Henry Hugh Tudor. And the military themselves, the military intelligence, were very unhappy with this. They were led by a man called John Brind. But it shows to an extent, again, this problem that the British had, that one hand didn't necessarily know what the other hand were doing. In the popular version of Bloody Sunday, the IRA wipe out a thing called the Cairo Gang. Now, I think this is basically a myth. There wasn't really a group called the Cairo Gang. It certainly wasn't a group of spies imported from Egypt, where there had been an uprising in 1919. But as I said, there was over 100 military intelligence operatives brought into Dublin, having been trained at Hounslow. Some of them, like Amos and Bennett, who were killed on Bloody Sunday, met informants at the Cairo Cafe on Grafton Street. And three of the people they met were actually IRA intelligence officers, Tom Cullen, Frank Thornton, and Frank Soren. They met them thinking they were informants, and at the Cairo Cafe on Grafton Street. And so I think this is where the term the Cairo Gang comes from, simply because they tended to meet at this cafe on Grafton Street. Now, for example, Charles Townsend, the historian, has pointed out what kind of spy meets in the open at a cafe, but nevertheless, that's what happened. They were certainly getting close to IRA GHQ. So there was a raid, for example, on Richard Mulcahy, who again was IRA Chief of Staff's office on Bachelor's Walk. This is in October 1920, where they captured a list of basically all the volunteers in the Dublin IRA. A number of the heads of the intelligence department, like Liam Tobin and Frank Thornton, were arrested, but they were unable to identify them, which again probably shows this mix-up where so many files from the Dublin police had gone missing. They were released again. Two of Collins' most kind of trusted gunmen from outside of Dublin, Sean Tracy and Dan Breen, who he had tended to be bringing into Dublin to carry out killings before that, Tracy was killed in a shootout on Talbot Street, and Breen was shot and wounded in a raid on a safe house in Drumcondra and nearly captured. And probably the most significant captures were Dick McKee and Pater Clancy. Dick McKee was the head of the Dublin Brigade of the IRA, and Pater Clancy, his deputy, were captured just before Bloody Sunday. So whatever the limitations of this British military intelligence operation was, they were getting close really to decapitating the top of the IRA in late October, early November 1920. Hence, the plan of IRA intelligence that this group had to be wiped out. This photo is often termed the Cairo gang, and it's not the case actually. What you're seeing here is F Company of Auxiliaries. Now, this is the company that was based in Dublin Castle, and they would sometimes operate in mufti, as it was called at the time, in civilian clothes. And that's what we see here. F Company was a particularly brutal group of men. Sometimes they operated with intelligence officers. And one of the things they did, for example, just before Bloody Sunday, which shows the climate that we're in, is that they assassinated a man called O'Carroll, who was the father of two volunteers, and they left a note on him saying, killed as a traitor to Ireland IRA. So they assassinate this man who was a civilian. He was killed because of who his sons were, but they also trying to spread disinformation. And it shows the kind of dirty war that you're dealing with. So Dublin, up to this point, hadn't seen kind of full-on combat since 1916, but it did see this kind of dirty war, this war of assassinations and reprisals. So Michael Collins, who, as I said, his role was the director of intelligence, he figured that he needed to do two things, really, to eliminate this threat to the IRA command, but also to show that this wave of reprisals in late 1920 was not getting on top of the Republican movement, that they could hit back. So they planned a mass coordinated assassination of military intelligence officers. So we're going to see there was 14 killed on the morning of Bloody Sunday, but there was a plan to kill 50. It was compiled by Frank Thornton and Tom Cullen, who were officers in Collins' intelligence department. There was a meeting of the Dáil Ministry of Defence and Cathal Brugha, who tended not to get on with Collins or Mulcahy throughout the period, and later on they ended up on opposite sides in the Civil War. But Brugha vetoed many of the targets. He said there wasn't enough evidence against them, and the list was reduced down to 35. Some people, like for example Thornton, later say it was 20. The list hasn't survived. One point about this is that while Collins issues the order, he issues the directive, he's not involved in the nitty-gritty of the planning. He delegates that to people. And the actual operation wasn't planned by Collins either, or intelligence. It was planned by the Dublin Brigade. So one thing to stress about Bloody Sunday morning is it wasn't the squad operation. It was an operation by the Dublin Brigade. Like, the squad had at most 20 members. At this point, less than that. There was around 165 is the number in the military pensions, but there may be as many as 200 men and women involved in the attacks. So they had to get ordinary members of the IRA Dublin Brigade, many of whom hadn't fired a shot since 1916, if at all. They were going to carry out this really brutal kind of up close and personal kind of attack, this kind of killing. Todd Andrews, who later wrote a memoir, Dublin Made Me, was one of them. He was a young man of 19 at the time, and he said we were very excited, but it didn't match with our idea of warfare, of stand-up fighting. And I think this is probably quite a typical reaction. But Dick McKee, who was the head of the Dublin Brigade, and Sean Russell, they were responsible for selecting the units and the men who were going to be involved in these attacks. Usually a group would go along with a squad member or an intelligence department officer. Mostly they were from Sean Russell's 2nd Battalion, which was in the northeast of the inner city. And another aspect of the plan, which isn't often talked about, is there was a plan for widespread commercial attacks in England. And this goes back to the idea of it wasn't just about the intelligence war. It was also this idea of showing that the Republicans could hit back after this kind of British counteroffensive in the summer and the autumn of 1920. There was plans for arson on the Liverpool docks, plans to disable a power station in Manchester, and plans to attack various commercial properties in London by fire. Now, this plan was found in Richard Mulcahy's office when it was raided in late October, early November 1920, and so that part of it was called off. But the assassinations, of course, went ahead. Now here's Michael Collins in civilian clothes, as he would have been throughout the period. This operation shows quite a ruthless side to Michael Collins. I would say that the violence that he used wasn't indiscriminate. It was selective. It was for a political aim, but Collins certainly was a ruthless man. And you can kind of see that, I think, in the expression in his eyes here a little bit. Okay, so that brings us to the morning of Bloody Sunday. Now, the raids, I have the picture here, which is of the Auxiliaries dismounting, mounting one of their raids in Dublin City. But the raids were mounted early in the morning. Part of Collins' plan was that all of the killings had to happen simultaneously at 9 o'clock in the morning on the 21st of November. So there's 165 men and women involved in the Dublin Brigade and Cumann na Man. The role of the women was to take the weapons off the men after they carried out the shootings and to hide them. So there was a detachment of Cumann na Man along with each squad as well, or each detachment, I should say, as well as the squad men. And each each detachment had to issue a report to Paddy O'Daly, who was a squad officer, who was supposed to kind of collate them afterwards. There was 35 men on the list, 35 officers. Many of the targets were not at the addresses visited. So one battalion, which is the northwest of the city, they were supposed to carry out the attacks up around the Phoenix Park and that kind of area. And they didn't, for some reason. And Charlie Dalton, for example, who was an intelligence officer, was very critical of this. They didn't carry out any raids. Elsewhere in the city, like, for example, Todd Andrews, who I mentioned, raided a house in Ranelagh of an officer named Noble, who was actually a member of the Auxiliaries. And Noble wasn't in, and that was quite common. So 18 men were shot dead that day, and out of 35. And at first, IRA command was actually kind of disappointed that they got so few relatively of their targets. 4 wounded, of whom 1 later died. Now, those are the bald facts, but I want to speak a little bit about the horror of the day. And this is from the point of view of the perpetrators in a sense, as well as the victims, because most of these, with the exception of 1 or 2 of the squad members, most of these men hadn't fired a shot before in many cases, certainly hadn't carried out an assassination before. So, for example, in Pembroke Street, 2 addresses were visited, and they were visited by a squad under the command of Charlie Dalton of Intelligence and Paddy Flanagan. Most of the men were from K Company of 2 Battalion. And Charlie Dalton and Paddy Flanagan left accounts, so they said they broke in the door of 38 Pembroke Street, and they found the officer in there lying in bed. He sat up in his pajamas, and Flanagan shot him. Dalton said, "Let's get his papers," because that was his job as an intelligence officer. And Flanagan said, "No, let's get the hell out of there." Dalton spoke later about how he had an overwhelming desire to run, and this is probably adrenaline kicking in and fear. Next door, inexperienced IRA gunmen broke into a boarding house where I think there were 5 officers staying. And the wife of one of the officers left this very harrowing account. Says basically the IRA men seemed to have chased the officers all over the house trying to get them. There were bullets pockmarking the hall. There were splashes of blood all over the place. But testament probably to the nervousness of many of the men who were inexperienced at this kind of thing. None of them were shot dead. One of them later died, but none of the 5 men shot there were killed. Elsewhere on Mount Street, there was an officer named Newbury, who Bill Stapleton, who was a squad member, and unlike the men on Pembroke Street, was an experienced gunman. They broke in, and Newbury's pregnant wife was there. Newbury tried to climb out the window in his pajamas. He was shot several times, came back in, and Stapleton questioned him about his papers, where they were, and then he shot him in the head. And that's the kind of brutality of the day. Todd Andrews, who, as I said, his target wasn't there, but his girlfriend or mistress was there. And Andrews was very critical of Joe Dolan, who was the intelligence officer there. They set fire to the house, and they beat Noble's girlfriend or mistress. So, whatever way you come down on the politics of it, on a human level, it's terribly brutal. And many of the men who carried it out were quite traumatized. Like I mentioned, K Company there, of 2nd Battalion, who carried out the shootings on Pembroke Street. They wouldn't submit a report on what they did. And quite a few of them never returned to IRA operations afterwards. Sean Lemass, the future Taoiseach, commanded a detachment who went to Earlsfort Terrace. Now, his particular squad, again, the man wasn't in, but Lemass, again, never wanted to talk about Bloody Sunday. He's interviewed about it for his military pension much later in the 1940s, and they asked him, "What did you do on Bloody Sunday?" And he said, "I commanded my company." And they said, "And what did your company do?" And he said, "We carried out all orders that were issued." So a lot of the people who did it were kind of traumatized by it, didn't want to talk about it. But that's I suppose the nature of this kind of warfare. Now, who was killed? Well, this is a picture of some of the officers who were killed. 9 were army officers. 1 was an off-duty officer, so that's 10, of whom another died later. So in total, 11 officers. 6 were intelligence officers. 1 was a staff officer. 2 were court-martial officers. And court-martial includes things like, for example, sentencing IRA prisoners to hang, like Kevin Barry, who had been hanged on November the 1st. 1 was an RIC officer who was just out of the army. He was an Irishman, but I suppose you can call him a black and tan in that sense. He was a war veteran recruited into the RIC. 2 of them were auxiliaries who happened upon the shootings at Mount Street, and they were shot down. And there were 3 others. So those are the servicemen who were killed. The others were killed in the Gresham Hotel, and this particular operation, it appears the intelligence was a bit faulty. There's 2 in the Gresham and 1 in Moorhampton Road. Thomas Smith was the landlord at Moorhampton Road, where several officers were shot, but he just seems to have been in the wrong place at the wrong time. At the Gresham Hotel, men from 2nd Battalion again, who carried out most of the shootings, shot dead 2 people, James McCormack and Leonard Wilde. Now, James McCormack was an army officer, yes, just back from Egypt, yes, but he was an army veterinary corps officer. His job was to look after horses. And he appears to have been in Ireland on a job to buy horses, actually. It doesn't appear to have been anything to do with the war effort, if you like. Leonard Wilde, again, was another ex-serviceman who had served with the British Embassy in Spain. His job there actually was some sort of secret service. He was supposed to count German shipping, I believe, in the Mediterranean. It's not clear what he was doing in Ireland. He may have been a secret serviceman. Mark Sturgis, whom I quoted before about Winter, is the senior civil servant in Dublin Castle, thought that he was. But he may simply have been an eccentric civilian. And one of the things that he had done in Ireland was there was a deputation from the Labour Party in Ireland reporting very critically on British reprisals, and Leonard Wilde had written to them saying he wanted to be involved there. So it's not clear what Leonard Wilde was doing, but he appears to have been a civilian. Now, the British reaction, as I said, the IRA were initially kind of disappointed that they had missed so many of their targets. They certainly hadn't wiped out British intelligence, but what they did do was temporarily terrify it. And there's accounts of officers and their wives fleeing to Dublin Castle after the shootings for protection. And the official army history of the period said the murders of November 21st temporarily paralyzed the Army Special Branch. Several of its most efficient officers were murdered, and the majority of other officers were brought into the castle, Dublin Castle, and the Central Hotel for safety. The centralization in the most inconvenient of places possibly greatly decreased the opportunities for obtaining information and for re-establishing anything in the nature of the Secret Service. And we see this picture here of coffins being taken down to the North Wall. So the officers were given elaborate funerals in Westminster Cathedral and so on. And the press response and the public response in Britain was very much kind of shock and horror at these terrible murders. So they were seen. However, as we'll see, the political response was kind of somewhat different. We'll get back to that. Now, but on the day itself, how did the British forces respond? Well, General Macready, who was the commander-in-chief of British forces in Ireland, ordered a raid on Croke Park, where Dublin and Tipperary were due to play a Gaelic football match. Now, why would he have done this? Why would you raid a football crowd? The orders were to search the crowd for weapons and suspects. Well, the army was aware of Dan Breen and Sean Tracy, who were Tipperary IRA men, who had previously been brought up to Dublin to carry out shootings. For example, like they'd been in on the attempt to assassinate Sir John French, who was the Lord Lieutenant, highest ranking official in Ireland, in December 1919. Tracy had been killed about a month before, and Breen had been wounded and nearly captured. So the Dublin IRA, up to this point, this would change after, but up to this point hadn't done an awful lot off their own bat. And so the perception among the British military was that, again, Tipperary gunmen had been brought up under the cover of the Gaelic football match to carry out the morning shootings. And that was the rationale. I think it was a very bad plan from a security point of view. The crowd was between 5 and 15,000. I'm not sure we have an exact figure. How are you going to search that amount of people without it turning either into a stampede or a riot, let alone with the kind of trigger-happy and a disciplined police that you've got in Ireland, who are going to be itching for revenge after the morning's happenings? Another problem that kicks in, and this is a problem that I've alluded to before, but it plagued the British counterinsurgency in Ireland in 1920 and 21, was divided command. So you have a three-pronged force that go to Croke Park. On the one hand, you have the RIC from the Phoenix Park Depot. Now, Dublin was primarily policed by the Dublin Metropolitan Police, but they were unarmed. And in October 1920, those few of them who had carried arms refused to do so anymore. So they're not available. The RIC is the armed force that polices the rest of Ireland. Now, the training depot is at the Phoenix Park. You have both old Irish RIC and new recruits, black and tans, and they're led by a Major Dudley. You have an auxiliary company led by Major Mills, and these are tough, heavily armed war veterans. RIC were mostly war veterans as well, of course, by this point. And you have the British Army, the regular army, the Wellington Regiment, led by Lieutenant Colonel Bray. And these are all independent commands. So they have their orders from General Macready, yes, but nobody is really responsible for this force in total. There's no clear command. Many of the force are very newly recruited, so-called police, really. They're armed and they're vengeful. This is Croke Park at the time. It's nothing like the Croke Park of today. It's really just a pitch surrounded by kind of mud banks. Now, the plan for the search was that the military were going to approach from the north, from the Hill 16 end today. And their job was just to act as a blocking force, because technically the military wasn't supposed to be searching civilians, or that was the theory anyway. The police, so that's the RIC and the auxiliaries, approached from the other end, the canal end, and their job was to go into the crowd and to search civilians. It wasn't much of a plan for my money. However, what happened? Well, but just before I get onto that, I mean, word reached the IRA that there was this military order given that they were going to raid Croke Park. And Sean Russell, who was the head again of 2nd Battalion, whose area included Croke Park, went down to the GA, the Gaelic Athletic Association, and tried to get them to call off the game. The GA figured that they couldn't do it because, you know, it would create more chaos. This is within, you know, a few minutes of kickoff. So the RIC and the auxiliaries arrived at the southern end of the ground, and almost as soon as they dismounted their lorries, they began firing. And it appears what happened was the ticket sellers outside were taken by the police to be lookouts, and you know, the police advanced on them. The ticket sellers started running away, at which point the police opened fire. I say police, this is how they're referred to. I mean, whether the auxiliaries, for example, especially were police in any meaningful way, we can dispute. But one of the significant things is nobody actually gave the order to start fire. Major Mills delivered a report, and his is the quote that I've seen above. It was a rotten show, the worst I've ever seen. And he said, the RIC and the Black and Tans fired into the crowd without any provocation whatsoever. Now, Mills is doing two things here. I think he's speaking honestly from the point of view of the lack of discipline, the lack of command, but also he's blaming the RIC rather than his men, the auxiliaries. He says that he and Dudley, who was in command of the RIC, tried to stop the firing, but it went on for 90 seconds. So 90 seconds, a minute and a half, there was around 220 rounds fired. Some Black and Tans wanted to execute the whole Tipperary team. Again, this conception that the Tipperary team were secretly IRA men who had carried out the morning shootings, and Mills says he stopped them doing that. But there was 13 killed on the day, of whom one died later, and 72 injured. Now, as for the military, they did fire. They had an armoured car at the north end of the ground, and as the crowd came fleeing out of the grounds, the armoured car's machine gun fired a number of rounds in the air. And while this didn't kill anyone directly, it did stampede the crowd back where they're from and come from, and probably did contribute to some of the killed and injured who were trampled to death. Now, I include this just because our perceptions of this event have been so shaped by popular media. So this is a still from Neil Jordan's 1996 film Michael Collins, and this shows the armored car. Now, the armored car is accurate for the period. It's a Lancia armored car. The military had an armored car outside. It didn't go inside the ground. Get out of your mind, if you can, you know, Neil Jordan's depiction of what happened at Bloody Sunday at Croke Park, because it wasn't anything like that. It was much more chaotic, and it was over much more quickly. And while a Tipperary player was killed, Michael Hogan was killed, you know, it wasn't bravely facing down an armored car. I'm afraid it was, you know, something much more chaotic. The police entered the ground shooting, and everybody was fleeing, and Hogan was one of the ones hit. Now, I talked about the brutality of the morning's killings, but obviously the killings of the afternoon, the shootings at Croke Park, were totally indiscriminate. I mean, there was actually one or two IRA men who had been out that morning who were at the game, including, for example, Thornton and Cullen, intelligence officers, but like none of them were hit. You know, it was totally innocent civilians. But secondly, from a security point of view, from a counterinsurgency point of view, if you like, it was a total fiasco. So Mills, again, the auxiliary commander on the day, in his report said the indiscriminate firing absolutely spoiled any chance of getting a hold of any people in possession of arms. They did search a number of the crowd. They didn't find any weapons or any suspects. So, you know, it was totally useless as a counterinsurgency operation. And probably more important, any moral high ground from the morning was lost, certainly in Ireland. Now, a little bit like later Bloody Sundays, the Crown Forces and the government, the British government, got out their version, which in a way, even again, made it worse. Hammer Greenwood, the Chief Secretary for Ireland, said the police were fired on and returned fire. So this is echoes of Derry in 1972. And they found 30 revolvers, and both of those things were false, and they were quite easily disproved. And Hammer Greenwood said in the House of Commons, the responsibility for the Croke Park shootings rests entirely upon those assassinations, and he says, who are making the lives of ordinary people in Ireland miserable. Now, in the House of Commons in Britain, there was long and loud condemnation of the morning shootings and the officers who, as they said, were murdered that day. Joe Devlin, who was not a Sinn Féin MP because Sinn Féin refused to take their seats in Westminster, but was a Irish Parliamentary Party MP for Belfast, tried to bring up the afternoon's killings, and he was shouted down, and there ended up being a physical brawl between Devlin and another member of Parliament. But what I'm getting at here is, from a propaganda point of view, any propaganda that you can make from these cruel assassins and how could they do this terrible thing this morning was totally lost by this reprisal at Croke Park. So as well as being cruel, it was also senseless. And the day was rounded off by really another very senseless killing. So I mentioned that Dick McKee had helped to plan Bloody Sunday, and so Pater Clancy, his second in command of the Dublin Brigade, and also another man, Clune, who wasn't an IRA member, he was a nationalist but not an IRA member, were arrested just before Bloody Sunday, and they were held in Dublin Castle by the Auxiliaries of F Company. And those are the guys who we have the picture of there in the trilby hats and so on. Well, those three were beaten and stabbed with bayonets and finally shot in Dublin Castle that evening. Now, again, this was cruel. This was summary execution of prisoners. Again, the government covered it up. So the statement that was issued was the Auxiliaries killed them in self-defense while they were trying to escape, which was nonsense, frankly. They were interrogated and then shot. But the other thing to consider is Dick McKee and Pater Clancy were the heads of the Dublin Brigade. They knew everything about the IRA in Dublin, and they could have told them everything that happened that day under sustained interrogation. And yet they were killed almost immediately after the event. The senselessness of it from a military or security point of view is what strikes you on reflection. That wasn't quite the end of the day's events, though. So a strict curfew was imposed in Dublin, a military curfew. Ernie O'Malley, in his memoir, leaves this kind of searing description of troops going around and hitting people with butts and telling them to go home, and shooting in the air. Several civilians were shot and wounded. There was another civilian shot and killed in Mountjoy Square, but by persons unknown. So someone got out of a car and shot this man, Henry Barnett, in Mountjoy Square. And it's a symptom of the times that nobody knows who it was. There was a journalist shot in Navan by Crown Forces. An auxiliary shot himself in Dublin Castle, either in an accident or suicide, I'm not sure. And there was a major roundup of activists after Bloody Sunday. So again, the military had arrested a lot of people early in the year in 1920. Had been forced to release them actually in March after a hunger strike, but they arrested loads more of civilian activists after Bloody Sunday, one of whom was Arthur Griffith, the acting president of the Irish Republic. Now, what's interesting about this is Brind, the head of military intelligence, now not Winter's operation, which we talked about, but the actual head of British Army intelligence, John Brind, see how complicated it got, said he actually arrested Griffith because he knew he was talking to the Prime Minister via back channels, and he was afraid that someone in the police would go and kill him off their own bat. That's kind of interesting. Its effect on the peace process, though, and this is kind of an interesting thing, and it shows the contradictory kind of conflict that this was. This is David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister. Lloyd George, as I said, he had many other things on his plate at the time. I mean, he was trying to reorder all of Europe and Asia at the time in the British Empire. But as regards Ireland, he was talking to Griffith about some sort of solution. And he sends a message to Griffith by back channels. Ask Griffith, for God's sake, to keep his head. Tragic as events in Dublin were, they are of no importance. These men were soldiers and took a soldier's risk. So apart from all this rhetoric about the cruel murders on Bloody Sunday morning, the heads of the British government took a very icily pragmatic view. And another little quote, which is from 2 years down the line, it's after the signing of the treaty, but after the signing of the treaty, it was debated in Westminster and passed, and someone asked Lloyd George a question at that point. This is early 1922. How many British servicemen lost their lives in Ireland in the last 2 years? And he rummaged through his files and he said it's about 500. And there was kind of a chorus of sighs of relief. They said, oh, that was only a bad morning on the Western Front. So for all the harshness of the morning's killings and for all the horror of them, this was a society which had just experienced a world war. And it has to be seen through that light as well. Now, it was certainly, my point though, is it wasn't the end of the peace process at all. So talks actually got off the ground, back channel talks through December. They were facilitated by Bishop Clune. He was an Irish bishop, but he was Bishop of Perth, Australia, and he acted as an intermediary. The British began to offer a thing called Dominion Home Rule, which is approaching something that they were to give in the treaty in December of the following year. They almost led to a truce in December. They fell through because the Hammer Greenwood, the chief secretary, Macready, the head of the military, and Tudor, the head of the police, said we can't have a truce until the IRA surrenders its weapons. And the IRA refused to do this. So the violence continued on until July of the following year. But Bloody Sunday, as regards the political process, in a way, was neither here nor there. The political process was going to travel its course anyway. What Bloody Sunday and events like it did, though, was it meant that the Republican movement was going to enter the talks as belligerents with a guerrilla army still in the field, and not as defeated rebels, if you like. Finally, the after effects. So I talked about the trauma of events on Bloody Sunday. Now, someone pulled me up in this before and said, well, because I'm going to talk about what it did to the IRA men. And they said, well, what about the Crown Forces and the people who tortured and killed, for example, McKee and Clancy and Clune? Did it traumatize them? And I say, okay, I don't know. But we have much more information on what it did to people in the IRA. Now, for example, Charlie Dalton, who is I think at 17 at this point, IRA intelligence officer, on the night of Bloody Sunday, he was so traumatized, so freaked out, I think you can say, by what he'd done. He thought he could hear the blood of the officers who he'd killed gurgling, and it was actually a tap that was left on in the safe house where he was staying. Sean Lamass tells us this, who was in a safe house with him. Paddy Flanagan was later certified as insane, I'm afraid, in the 1930s. And it is a very interesting quote from 1924 when there was an army inquiry and they looked back on many of the things that had been done. An officer called Charles Russell said, if there was shell shock in the IRA, this is referring to the squad, the men to look for it in were these men, the men of the squad. He said they were the shock troops of the IRA, but what they had done left them anything but normal. So there's a cost to doing stuff like this, a personal cost. There's martyr status for the British officers briefly. So we saw their coffins being draped in the Union flag, and they were given lavish funerals in Westminster and so on. In IRA circles for McKee and Clancy, Hogan still has a stand named after him in Croke Park, of course, but the civilian victims and many of the ordinary victims are largely forgotten, except as a number. Okay, I'll leave it there and I'll be happy to take your questions.
Thank you, John, for that brilliant talk. Absolutely fascinating and terrible subject, obviously. Particularly interesting, the after effects and the trauma experienced by those involved. I think that's something that's not often discussed, but really, really poignant. So now, as I mentioned at the start, it's over to you all to ask John your questions, and you can type those in the Q&A box down at the bottom. We've got a question in from Pascal, who asks, so first of all says, congratulations for the session, and asks, any good books to read about this tragic day? Yeah,
quite a few. The very good one on Croke Park is called The Bloodied Field by Michael Foley. Michael Foley is a sports historian, but he's written a very good book, and it also covers the morning's events. But it's especially good though on the events in Croke Park, and it talks also about the kind of Gaelic football angle and its effect on sports history. I recommend, for the political context and the wider context, Charles Townsend's The Republic. It's a very detailed kind of work, but it's very good, and it has a lot of the kind of background detail in terms of the Crown Forces and the British political side and what they were thinking. There's also an excellent essay in I can't remember the book, but I think the essay is available online as well, by Anne Dolan of Trinity College, called Ending War in a Sportsmanlike Manner. And it's about this idea of the up close and personal kind of killing the people in the squad and other similar units in the IRA were asked to do, and its effect on them personally. And I'd really recommend that. I think it's very interesting. Brilliant, thank you. Coleman asks, you gave a figure of 500 English soldiers killed. Over what period was that? Yeah, now that's a figure that's given in Westminster in 1922. Now, there's recently been an awful lot of work done. There's a book out called The Dead of the Irish Revolution by Ewan O'Halpin and Dahi O'Croran of Trinity. And the figure is actually higher than this. So they're between 1916 and 1922, there's 800 Crown Forces servicemen killed in Ireland. Now, they're not all soldiers. I think roughly now, about 300 of them are British Army and 500 of them are police. Of the police, I think about, let's say if there's 500 killed police, roughly 250 to 300 were actually Irish members of the RIC. The remainder were Black and Tans and Auxiliaries, so war veterans recruited from Britain. Of the soldiers, there's around 150 soldiers killed in the Easter Rising of 1916, and the remainder would have been killed between 1919 and 1921, but overwhelmingly actually in 1921, really, like 20 and 21.
Thank you. Common also asks, Mill appears to have been willing to give an honest account. Where can his report be read?
Yeah, again, it can be read in full in Michael Foley's book, The Bloody Field. It's quoted in the text, but it's also given in full in an appendix. It's very illuminating.
Brilliant, thank you. So any more questions, feel free to type them in. I'm sure, obviously, sorry, John, you go ahead.
Is there a couple of questions in chat there as well?
Oh no, that was me typing in the books you were mentioning.
Okay.
Q&A is the only way that that if you have a question, you can pop it in there.
Mm-hmm.
More questions. From Common again, you mentioned that Dominion status was offered much earlier than I thought. When was it offered?
Yeah, it's broached in December of 1920. Like the background here, there's a whole other, we often talk about the kind of military events and the trajectory of those events, but there's a whole other political side that goes on behind the scenes. So there's this kind of crisis for the British administration in Ireland in early 1920, where they're apparently losing control of the country, not so much through violence, but through kind of the setting up of the parallel Sinn Féin state, taking over county councils, setting up their own courts and so on. There's also a mass hunger strike in 1920 where they have to release all the prisoners. It appears the kind of force isn't working, or it's not being deployed very well. And they bring in a whole new bunch of people on the political side, the civil servant side. And there's Sturgis, I mentioned, was one of them, Andy Cope and Anderson. These three particular guys in Dublin Castle really very much saw themselves as liberals, both in terms of, probably supporters of the Liberal Party in Britain, but also like they said, we're not imperialists, we're not here to impose our will, we're trying to get an equitable solution here. And so Cope is very much saying all the way along, we can't walk their demands back to home rule, to limited self-government, to the equivalent of devolution, something like Northern Ireland or Scotland has today by way of comparison. That's not going to fly because the Irish electorate have gone beyond that. You have to offer something more. And even people like Macready, the commander-in-chief of the military, begins to say something like this. He says, we need a political solution here, because he says, I can use military methods that we would use kind of in far-flung parts of the empire. And this would include like, indiscriminate bombing, for example, of villages, wholesale executions, 100 executions a month. But these are citizens of the United Kingdom. It's politically impossible. So Cope in particular starts to recommend Dominion Home Rule in December of 1920. Now, however, Lloyd George is a tricky customer. Lloyd George says a lot of things, and he eventually gives Dominion status in the treaty. But talking about giving it in December 1920 is a different thing. What he's doing at the time is he's trying to bring the Republican movement into a political process. He's trying to get them to give up their arms and stuff like that. So, but the idea is broached in December of 1920, yes.
Thank you. A question from Michelle. Can you advise on how to get information about family who may have been involved? I've been in touch with the barracks in Rathmines and got some more information, but that's more about 1921 and 1922. But I'm looking for the Dublin Sea Brigade, 1920. So history, but of family members, as I've heard many versions. Thanks for the great presentation. Will you be willing to share the slides? I can answer that for that last bit there. This talk is being recorded, so if you've missed anything, you will be able to watch back. We'll share that on our website at a later date.
So in answer to the family history question, there's two great sources online. One of them, I think the military archives in Dublin Barracks have already been onto you, but the military pensions are absolutely invaluable. In most cases, your relative will have a military pension application, and that will say what they told the military pension board, what that they did, and they have to have references and stuff like that. It's pretty good, especially the ones who were anti-treaty in the Civil War, and the reason for that is because they had a much more stringent process after 1934 of application. They had to be interviewed and so on. So pro-treatyites, ironically, even though they set up the pensions, have a less informative pension application. But the other great source is the Bureau of Military History, which is an oral history project, which was set up from the 1940s, and it's the kind of freestyle testimony, if you like, of IRA veterans. So it doesn't have the strictures of the pension board, which has strengths and weaknesses. They can go on digressions and stuff like that, but they weren't tested as they were for the pension board. You mentioned your relative was in C Company. Now, the thing to remember about that is the Dublin Brigade has 4 battalions, but it has 6 battalions eventually, but 4 city battalions. And so you want to identify the battalion and then the company before you get down to finding out, what the right one is.
Great, thank you. And I'll put the web address for the Bureau of Military History into the chat box there. Coleman asks, where could I find reputable reports or accounts of the English side of the story of Bloody Sunday?
There's actually a very good website called the Cairo Gang, which talks about the British officers who were killed, and from their perspective, it's a private individual, but he's devoted well over a decade now to assembling the stories of the British officers who were killed on Bloody Sunday, and you get a pretty good idea there of the story that was reported in the press at the time in Britain about those men.
Thank you. Dave Kavanagh asks, are there any walking tours about Bloody Sunday? I know there are a few on the 1916 Easter Rising.
I don't know is the answer. I think Lorcan and Collins might have one, but I don't know, I'm afraid.
Worth a Google, and obviously worth checking if there are any, whether they're running at the moment. I know some outdoor tours are operating again, if you can brave the cold. Lots of people saying thank you for the talk. Okay, well, we're coming up to the end now, so any more questions, feel free to put them in. And obviously it was only a couple of weeks ago that it was 100 years to the day that Bloody Sunday happened, and I'm sure that many of you saw some of the commemorative events that were happening, so we'd love to hear your thoughts on any of those if you saw any of them as well. Did you catch any of those, John?
Yeah, it was obviously very restrained because of COVID. What's interesting is that the commemorations of the War of Independence are totally different from 1916, and I think it's to do with the type of violence and our idea of kind of what's chivalrous, what's sportsmanlike, to quote Anne Dolan's essay. 1916 was a terribly violent event. There's 500 people killed in a week, so it was much more bloody than Bloody Sunday. About half of them were civilians, but we have this idea that Bloody Sunday was a stand-up, that 1916 was a stand-up fight. The volunteers wore uniforms and they fought in the open, so to speak. And our ideas of violence aren't so easily adjustable to a thing like Bloody Sunday, where it's clandestine assassination and reprisals and murders and so on. Which is ironic in one way, because 1916 was a far bloodier event. But in terms of the commemorations, I thought the GA did quite a good job. I mean, it was quite dignified. It was, mournful. It wasn't celebrating acts of violence. Like, my perspective on the decade of commemorations is we should be very proud of the struggle for independence, but we shouldn't celebrate, political violence or the act of taking life.
Another question here from Michelle. Are there any closed files that were locked for X amount of years that have come online or available to the public now about 1920? That's a good question.
Yeah, I mean, an awful lot of British government files were released in the last 20 years. I can't swear to you exactly where they were found, but I mean, like I quoted Sturgis on Winter, and that kind of a confidential file of the top levels of Dublin Castle were opened certainly in the last 20 years. In terms of the Irish side, I mean, all of the files that we have now were opened in the last really 4 or 5 years or 6 years, between the Bureau of Military History and the military pension files. Everything was a secret until certainly in the last 10 years. We have really unprecedented access. It's a golden age in that way.
Learning more all the time. 100 years isn't very long at all, is it?
Not really.
Brilliant. Well, just check, see if there are any final questions. Just lots of people saying thank you for a brilliant talk, and I can echo that. Thank you so much, John. So I think we will wrap up there for the evening. So once again, thank you, John, so much for that. And thank you all for coming along this evening. Do keep an eye out for other Mondays at the Mess talks. They'll be online certainly for the next couple of months, so you can watch them from the comfort of your own living room. And yeah, just again, thank you for being with us, and have a lovely evening.
Thank you.